All right, so are you ready to dive into some true crime today?
Always.
Let's take a look at Richard Macek, also known as the Mad Biter.
Okay.
I have to admit, I'd never heard of this case before.
Yeah.
But some of the stuff that I read getting ready for this deep dive was really chilling.
It's a case that definitely stays with you.
Yeah.
And what I find particularly interesting is how Macek's story kind of shows how forensic science has changed over time, especially bite mark
Oh,
analysis.
yeah, for sure. We should get into that.
Yeah, we'll get into that.
So our main sources for this deep dive are going to be excerpts from his Wikipedia page,
Okay.
and then this really interesting book called My Life Among the Serial Killers
Oh, wow.
by Helen Morrison and Harold Goldberg.
Interesting.
And this book really goes into the psychology of violent criminals,
Yeah.
which is super fascinating,
Oh, I bet.
but also kind of disturbing.
Of
I do want to
course.
give everyone a heads up that we're dealing with some violent crimes, including murder in this deep dive.
Right.
So listener discretion is advised.
It's important to acknowledge that right from the beginning.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you know what? I think we should remember the victims and their families during this deep dive.
Yeah, 100%.
Their stories are really at the center of all of this.
Yeah, definitely. And, before we really get into the heavy stuff, we should mention that while Macek was convicted of 3 murders,
Right.
there's a good chance he was responsible for more. And
Wow.
we'll get into all that.
Okay.
At first, let's rewind back to the beginning.
Okay.
Who was Richard Macek before he became the Mad Biter?
So he was born in Chicago in 1948, and he later moved to McHenry, Illinois.
Okay.
From what we know, his childhood seemed pretty normal.
Uh-huh.
But looking back, there were some early signs that something was a little bit off.
Oh, really? Like what kind of signs? What hits at this darkness to come?
Well, for one, he was dishonorably discharged from the Army
Wow.
after only 6 months.
Oh, wow.
And the reason they gave was failure to adjust,
Okay.
which could mean a lot of things, really. But Morrison and Goldberg, in their book, they say that this kind of difficulty conforming to rules and authority,
Yeah.
it's something you see pretty often in violent offenders.
Interesting. So maybe it's not like a traumatic childhood that puts
Right.
someone on this path,
Yeah.
but more of like a basic inability to fit into, what society expects.
Yeah, that's one theory.
Okay.
Definitely worth exploring.
Yeah.
And as Macek got older, his problems with authority, well, they turned into a pretty serious criminal record.
Oh, no.
I mean, we're talking charges from like peeping to aggravated battery and even an attempted murder charge in Elwood Park, Illinois.
So this wasn't just petty stuff.
No, no.
He was escalating.
Exactly. And there's this one incident that I think really gives us a glimpse of how ruthless he was.
Okay.
This was back in 1973.
Okay.
He hit 2 young girls with his car and then just drove away.
Oh, my God.
Luckily, they weren't seriously hurt,
Yeah.
but it shows a real disregard for others. It's
Yeah.
lack of empathy,
Uh,
pretty disturbing.
I see what you mean. It's like that incident just showed that he wasn't a normal guy who made a mistake.
Right.
There was just a coldness there that's really unsettling.
Yeah.
Then in August of 1974, things took a really horrific turn.
Okay.
His first known murder victim was a 24-year-old maid named Paula Atkinson Cupid.
Right.
She was working at the Abbey Resort in Fontana, Wisconsin.
Yeah, it's the level of brutality in this case. And really all of Macek's crimes.
Yeah.
It's just hard to stomach.
Yeah.
Paula was sexually assaulted. She was stabbed multiple times
Oh, my God.
and strangled so violently that her neck was broken.
Oh, my God.
It seems like he just wanted to inflict as much pain as possible.
That's awful. It's awful to even think about.
Yeah.
And then barely a month later, another tragedy.
Right.
Nancy Lossman, who was 27,
Okay.
and her 3-year-old daughter, Lisa.
Oh my gosh.
They were found murdered in their apartment in Crystal Lake, Illinois, after a fire.
The brutality is just striking.
Yeah.
Nancy had been strangled and there were bite marks on her breast.
Oh, wow.
And this becomes really crucial to the investigation later on.
Okay, so 2 incredibly violent murders in a very short period of time.
Right.
Were the police starting to connect the dots at this point, or was Macek flying under the radar?
Well, remember, this was the early 70s,
Yeah.
long before DNA profiling and all the
Yeah.
criminal databases we have now.
Yeah.
So investigators were really relying on traditional methods like witness statements and physical evidence they found at the scene.
Right.
And sadly, in those early days, Macek was good at covering his tracks.
That makes sense, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But then a year later, Macek's luck seems to run out, or maybe it was one of his victims had a stroke of luck.
Yeah.
He attacked a 20-year-old woman named Sharon Lee Kulisek
Okay.
while she was doing laundry in Woodstock, Illinois.
Wow.
And she fought back with everything he had.
Kulisek's bravery is amazing.
Yeah.
Not only did she fight back physically, but she got to a phone
Oh my gosh.
and called the police while Macek was still in the building.
Oh my gosh.
It's thanks to her that he was finally caught.
That's incredible that she was able to think that clearly
Yeah.
in such a scary situation. But the story gets even crazier.
Okay.
While he was awaiting trial for Kulisek's attack, Macek escaped from custody.
I know. It's unbelievable.
Yeah.
He somehow got all the way to California.
Oh, wow.
But luckily, law enforcement caught up with him and extradited him back to Illinois.
Okay.
And it was during that process, while they were piecing together information from different places, that they started to notice some similarities between Macek and the unsolved murders of Paula Cupid and Nancy Lossman.
I bet that's when things really got going with the investigation.
Yeah.
What were the key pieces of evidence that linked Macek to these murders?
Well, there were the obvious similarities in the way he targeted women who were in vulnerable situations and the extreme violence in each attack.
Right.
But the real breakthrough came from those bite marks found on Nancy Lossman's body. It was groundbreaking forensic science back then, and it would eventually lead to Macek's downfall.
So the nickname Mad Biter wasn't just some media thing.
No, not at all.
It was based on evidence.
It came from actual evidence.
Wow.
Forensic odontologists, basically experts in dental evidence, analyzed those bite marks, and they matched them to Macek's dental records.
Oh, wow.
It was one of the first times that bite mark analysis played such a major role in a murder investigation.
That's incredible to think that something as unique as a bite mark could be used to solve a crime.
Yeah.
So these bite marks basically ended up being his undoing.
They were absolutely crucial. And remember, this was before DNA profiling, so bite mark analysis was really advanced stuff back then.
Yeah.
It led to Macek being convicted of the attempted murder of Sharon Kulisek.
Okay.
He got 50 to 70 years for that.
Wow.
But that was just the beginning.
So it sounds like he was finally facing the consequences of his actions.
He was, but the story is far from over.
Okay.
He also pleaded guilty to the murder of Paula Cupid.
Oh, wow.
And got a life sentence for that.
Oh, my gosh.
And then he was convicted of Nancy Lossman's murder.
Okay.
And got another sentence of 200 to 400 years for that one.
Wow. So 3 convictions, multiple life sentences?
Yeah.
Case closed, right?
Well, not exactly. Remember those other potential victims we talked about?
Yeah.
This is where things take a really dark turn.
Okay.
And where that bite mark evidence becomes questionable.
Okay.
But before we get into that, maybe this is a good place to pause and let it all sink in a bit.
Yeah, you're right. It's a lot to process. So we know that Richard Macek was a dangerous guy.
Yeah, to say the least.
But now we're getting into some really complicated stuff.
Right.
Where the science that put him away starts to raise some questions.
Exactly. It's a classic example of how advancements in forensic science can be good and bad,
Yeah.
In Macek's case, bite mark analysis helped get convictions for some really awful crimes.
Right.
But it also might have led to a wrongful conviction in another case.
Right.
Which is really disturbing.
This is where my brain starts to hurt. Can you explain bite mark analysis for me?
Sure.
Like, what is it and how does it work?
Okay, so think about a fingerprint.
Okay.
It's unique to each person.
Right.
Our teeth are kind of like that, too.
Okay.
Everyone has a slightly different arrangement, different sizes and shapes. Even tiny imperfections that make a unique pattern.
Okay.
So when someone bites hard enough to leave a mark, forensic odontologists can look at those marks and compare them to dental records.
So it's like dental fingerprinting.
Exactly.
That makes sense. But you said this kind of analysis can be unreliable.
Right.
What are the problems?
Well, there are a few challenges. First, bite marks on skin are rarely perfect.
Okay.
They can get distorted, by movement or the elasticity of skin or even just the healing process.
Right.
Second, analyzing bite marks can be subjective. Different experts might look at the same bite mark and see different things.
Okay.
Which leads to disagreements about the match.
I see where the problems can come up. You mentioned a potential wrongful conviction.
Right.
Connected to Macek. What can you tell us about that?
This case involves a 14-year-old girl named Sally Candell.
Okay.
Who was murdered back in 1972.
Oh, gosh.
A guy named Richard Malone was convicted of the crime.
Okay.
Mainly based on bite mark evidence.
But you're saying Macek might have been the real killer.
Yeah, that's what Dr. Lowell Levine believes.
Okay.
He's one of the forensic odontologists who helped convict Macek.
Right.
He looked back at the evidence in the Candell case and concluded that the bite marks on her body were more likely made by Macek, not Malone.
So if Dr. Levine is right, it means an innocent man was in prison for a crime he didn't commit, while the real killer was free to hurt other people.
It's a scary thought, and we might never know the whole truth.
Right.
Macek never admitted to Candell's murder.
Right.
And he died before they could investigate further.
It feels like we're so close to uncovering something huge.
Yeah.
But we just can't quite get there.
I know it's frustrating. It's important to remember that forensic science is always changing.
Yeah.
What was cutting edge in the 70s might be questionable today.
Right.
Which is actually a good thing. It means we're always trying to get better and closer to the truth.
That's true, but it doesn't change what happened to Malone. He might have been in prison for years for something he didn't do.
Right.
Was he ever exonerated?
Sadly, no.
Oh, my God.
Despite what Dr. Levine found and Malone saying he was innocent over and over, the legal system moves really slowly. There's all this bureaucracy and appeals, and sometimes they're just reluctant to admit they made a mistake.
This is the part that makes me mad. An innocent man might have been punished, and the real killer was free to harm others. It's just, I don't even know what to say.
It's heartbreaking for sure. And this case, along with others like it, have really made people question bite mark analysis and its place in the justice system.
I get it. So what's the deal with bite mark analysis now?
Right.
Is it still used?
It's complicated. It hasn't been completely abandoned, but it's not used as much. Courts are more careful about letting in bite mark evidence now. They want more certainty from the experts.
So it's not just matching the bite mark to dental records anymore?
No, it's not that simple anymore. There's more scrutiny now.
So what's changed?
They focus more on things like how good the impression is, how experienced the odontologist is, and if there's other evidence to back it up. And that's a good thing. It means we're being more careful and scientific about using this kind of evidence.
I'm glad to hear that. But what about the cases that have already been decided based on bite mark evidence, especially if there are doubts about the conviction? Is there any hope for people who were wrongly imprisoned?
There's always hope. Organizations like the Innocence Project are dedicated to looking back at cases where questionable forensic science like bite mark analysis was used. They use things like DNA testing and other new techniques to challenge old convictions and fight to get people exonerated.
That's great. It's probably a long shot, but at least someone's fighting for justice.
Absolutely. And Macek's story is really dark, but it shows us how important it is to always question our methods and try to make them better, not just in forensic science, but in the whole justice system.
I agree. But let's get back to Macek for a minute. We were talking about those other potential victims. Besides Sally Candell, what else do we know?
Well, there's Cindy Decker. She was Macek's neighbor in McHenry. They found her body in a creek back in 1975.
Oh, wow.
And there were definitely suspicions about Macek.
But he wasn't charged.
No, they couldn't find enough evidence to connect him to it for sure.
So it's another unsolved mystery.
It is. It's frustrating to think he was probably responsible for more suffering, but there's just no proof.
It's hard to know that and not be able to do anything about it.
That's how it is with a lot of serial killer cases. They also leave a trail of unsolved crimes and unanswered questions. And Macek's case is even more complicated because of the questions that the bite mark evidence. It makes you wonder if there are other cases where he might have been misidentified or overlooked.
Yeah, I see how that would make it really tough for investigators. So we have 3 confirmed murders. At least 2 strong possibilities.
At least.
And who knows how many more.
It's a scary thought, and it shows that even when they catch a serial killer, there's still this feeling of unease. We might never know everything they did. And that's hard for the families of the victims and the communities where it happened.
This is all really heavy. Do we know anything about Macek's psychology? Like what made him do these things?
That's where the book My Life Among the Serial Killers comes in. The authors Helen Morrison and Harold Goldberg are forensic psychiatrists. They've spent their careers trying to understand violent criminals. They actually interviewed Macek a lot while he was in prison.
I can't imagine sitting across from someone like that and trying to understand my mind.
Yeah.
What did they learn from talking to him?
Well, it's complicated. There's no easy answer for why someone becomes a serial killer.
Of course.
But they did point out a few key factors that are probably important in Macek's case. Remember how we talk about his dishonorable discharge from the Army and his problems with authority? That seemed to be a pattern throughout his life.
So he was just different from the beginning.
Yeah, kind of. And then there's the fact that his crimes got worse over time. He started with minor offenses like peeping, but it escalated to more serious crimes like assault and eventually murder. This gradual desensitization to violence is something we see in a lot of serial killers. It's like each crime makes it easier to do the next one until even the worst acts become normal in their minds.
That's terrifying. It's like they lose their humanity.
And then there's the specific nature of Macek's attacks. Especially the biting. Morrison and Goldberg think this was his way of showing dominance over his victims. Like he wanted to literally leave his mark on them. It's really dehumanizing.
It's like he saw them as objects, not people.
Exactly. So what happened to Macek in the end?
Yeah, what happened?
He was incarcerated at the Dodge Correctional Institution in Waupun, Wisconsin.
Was he in solitary confinement?
You might be surprised to hear this, but he was actually in relatively comfortable conditions.
Really? That doesn't seem right.
Yeah, I don't know.
A serial killer living a good life in prison.
I know, it seems strange, but the prison system is complicated.
Right.
There are different levels of security and different ways of managing inmates.
Okay.
Even those convicted of violent crimes.
So he was living a somewhat normal life in prison. Then what?
In March of 1987, Macek died by suicide.
Oh, wow.
He hanged himself in his cell.
So he avoided any more justice for those other potential crimes.
It's a sad ending to an already horrible story.
Yeah.
And it leaves us with a lot to think about, the impact of his crimes on the families and the debate about how reliable forensic science is.
Right.
But maybe we should take a moment to just reflect on everything we've talked about so far.
Yeah, good idea. This is a lot to take in. We've been talking about Richard Macek, the Mad Biter.
Right.
And it's been a tough case to go through.
Yeah.
I think what I'm thinking about most is that even with convictions and tons of evidence, there's still so much we don't know for sure.
Absolutely. You've hit on a really crucial point.
Yeah.
Macek's story, especially the chance that he was wrongly connected to Sally Candel's murder, shows that even forensic science can have errors.
And that's what's so disturbing.
Yeah.
Someone could be convicted based on evidence that's later questioned.
Right.
It's scary. Makes you wonder about the whole system.
It's a totally valid concern.
Yeah.
And the Macek case shows how important it is to be careful and have high standards in forensic science.
Right.
It's not a perfect science.
Yeah.
And there's always room for mistakes.
Especially with bite mark analysis.
Exactly. So knowing what we know now about those potential errors, what's being done to prevent wrongful convictions.
Yeah, what is being done?
Well, a lot has changed since Macek's trials.
Okay.
The legal system is much more cautious about just relying on bite mark evidence.
Okay.
They want more proof.
Okay.
They look at the qualifications of the experts and how good the bite mark impression is.
So it's not just about matching the bite mark to dental records anymore.
Nope. There's way more scrutiny now.
That's good to hear. But what about those old cases where people were convicted based on bite marks?
Right.
Is there any hope for those people?
Absolutely. There are organizations like the Innocence Project. They're working hard to look at those cases again, using new technology like DNA testing to challenge those old convictions.
It's got to be a long process.
It is.
But it's good to know there's hope.
And beyond bite mark analysis, the Macek case has started a conversation about forensic science in general.
Okay.
It reminds us that we can't just assume everything's perfect.
Right.
We need to question things, look for bias, and be open to the possibility that mistakes were made.
Yeah, we can't let the goal of justice make us blind to mistakes.
Exactly. But let's talk about the victims and their families for a minute.
Yeah, we should. What kind of impact did Macek's crimes have on them?
That's an important part of this.
Yeah.
We can't forget the human cost.
Right.
The trauma, the grief, the feeling of loss and injustice.
Yeah.
Those things don't go away just because the trial is over.
It's hard to imagine what those families went through.
I know.
Paula Kupit's family.
Yeah.
Nancy and Lisa Lossman's family.
Right.
Sharon Kulisek.
Right.
And then the families of the other possible victims.
Right.
Who may never know for sure.
And it's not just the families who are directly affected.
Right.
These crimes affect the whole community.
Yeah.
They create fear, distrust, and a sense of vulnerability.
It shows how much violent crime can damage society.
It really does, and I think we need to recognize the bravery of the survivors.
Yeah.
Especially Sharon Kulisek.
Absolutely.
She fought back and called for help.
Yeah.
And that not only saved her life, but also helped put a dangerous criminal behind bars.
Yeah, her story is incredible.
Yeah, it is.
Shows the strength of the human spirit.
Absolutely. As we finish this deep dive, I think it's good to remember that even in these dark stories, there's still hope.
Yeah.
There are dedicated people in law enforcement and forensic science who work hard to solve these crimes.
Right.
There are survivors who find the strength to move on.
Yeah.
And there are groups like the Innocence Project who are fighting to fix things and make sure justice happens.
Those are powerful words to end on.
Yeah.
It's been a really emotional deep dive, honestly.
I know.
But it's been so eye-opening.
Yeah.
I feel like I know so much more now about Richard Macek.
Yeah.
About forensic science, about the justice system,
Yeah.
and about how much violent crime affects everyone.
I'm glad you found it valuable.
Yeah, I did.
Remember, knowledge is power.
Yeah.
The more we know about these things, the better we can advocate for change, support victims, and work towards a safer future.
I completely agree. Thank you so much for guiding me through this deep dive.
It was my pleasure.
And to everyone listening, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for listening.
It was a tough one,
right.
but an important one.
Very important.
We'll be back next time with another deep dive and a new case to explore.
Looking forward to it.
Until then, stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged.